asking about the future of public services and their relationship to devolution and what that could mean for a Conservative agenda going forward. My name is Polly Curtis. I am the Chief Executive of the cross-party think tank Demos, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all here. I know we've got some stiff competition in the main hall, so I know that we have got an audience here of people who really, really care about this subject. So thank you for coming, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So the new government has identified devolution and improving public services as essential elements to its mission to kickstart economic growth. How would the Conservative Party do this differently? How can devolving power to communities increase accountability and address the opportunities and challenges facing our public services today? The Conservative manifesto included a pledge to kickstart public services to serve citizens more. And that included workforce development and using data and AI in public services differently. But what's the role of devolution in public service reform? That's the kind of question we're asking today. And I've got the most brilliant, knowledgeable panel here to help us with this question. So Baroness Finn is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, and also worked with Francis Maud on the Open Government Initiative early on in the coalition, which I am a fangirl of. I thought it was a really interesting era for public service reform and how we do government. George Freeman MP is Member of Parliament for Mid Suffolk and was Norfolk. One of the two.
They're not dissimilar, but they are different.
They are very different. My parents live in Suffolk, so they would agree with you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Former Minister for Science and Research and Innovation. And Ian Murray is Director of Financial Management at SIPFA and a brilliant partner to Demos in all the work we're doing on public service reform. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kick off with some opening remarks on this challenge of public services and devolution. We're going to have a conversation amongst the panelists, and then we're really keen to get to questions from the floor and to bring you into the conversation too. So with that, I'm going to start with Baroness Finn.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Simone Finn, and I worked in Number 10, but a lot of this, a lot of public services reform I did when I was working for the 5 years in the coalition government for Francis Maud in the Cabinet Office. We'll probably come on to that. Just as my opening remarks, I was going to sort of just contextualise and make three sort of short points. So the context is that actually this is what's known as English devolution. So and it was kick-started in 2016 by a Conservative government when sort of George Osborne was a huge promoter of the Greater Manchester mayoralty, and that there was going to be substantive devolution and a new Metro Mayor, and there were two pillars to the devolution. One was the economic growth, and the other was public services. And there's actually been a fair amount of progress on the first, but a lot less on the second. So basically, it's seen as a ripe area and an untapped area for devolution and public services reform. So the 3 points are what it would not be, and no one thinks mayors should run public services. They don't have the time, so the idea is that they would be a strategic tier in government. And the second point is that it's not devolved, in that we're not going to repeat what was done in Scotland and Wales. So there's not going to be a Greater Manchester Ofsted or a South Yorkshire sort of area imposing its own curriculum. So what do people say the devolution of public services could be? So the mayors have the scale to do what local authorities can't do on their own. They can bring together a number of the local authority, the the local authorities, and that they then therefore bring a scale that central government can meaningfully engage with, which is actually really important. So the point is these combined levers of the constituent local authorities and central government could be quite a potent force for going forward. And then there are the problems of what would it actually need. So my first issue with it all is where's the accountability? Obviously, mayors are better known public figures than the local authority, than chiefs, etc. But there does need to be a sort of an accountability mechanism. I think it's been suggested that they could come before Parliament and actually account for what's going on. But I don't think it should be necessarily something that stands in the way. But what are the other conditions that would be necessary? I think it would be the ability to derogate from national approaches. There's no point having a model if the DWP person sitting in the room sort of has no ability to derogate from national targets and schemes. And the other problem that has been identified is the coterminosity of mayors with national public service boundaries. Apparently, that's a complete mess, and the alignment issues. I mean, now some of the PCCs are starting to align with the areas, but it's a real problem. However, I would argue that would be short-term pain for quite a long-term gain. And finally, it's money and time. So a lot of people see this as taking on a responsibility without the necessary funding. And I think that's quite important to know what money they're being given. And, and a lot of these mayors are quite new and they need time to settle in. So I think it would be quite a good idea that they take on, the alignment of powers they already have. So, for example, youth unemployment, mayors have responsibility for post-19 skills. Wouldn't it be a good idea to see how that area might work in further devolution? As I said, it's not popular. There's not a lot, it's not seen as popular by money, but there's not a lot of proof, therefore, because not much has happened, that it works. But I did stumble across this Lancet article that shows that the devolution of public services, the devolution of health in Greater Manchester has proven that there is better life expectancy than expected after devolution. And the benefits of devolution are apparent in areas with income deprivation and lowest life expectancy. So if that's actually the case, what's not to like and what's not to go forward with this agenda?
That sounds like really important emerging evidence that makes the case for this. And I imagine that's something that all the other combined authorities are watching incredibly closely.
Well, one would hope, but as I say, because it hasn't rolled out in the scale, it's very difficult. I mean, it's quite difficult to measure anyway. But it is. I find it quite interesting that this article does prove that it's working in the areas where one would hope that it would.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you so much for those introductory comments. I'm going to go to George.
Thank you. Can I just check, is this Chatham House or are we live broadcasting to the nation?
We are live broadcasting to the nation.
Okay. Are there any journalists here? Hands up. No? Okay, great.
Excellent. He's going to say some fruity stuff.
Well, one of the many benefits of being out of office and not having to do a 70, 80-hour-a-week job defeating the spadocracy that now runs governments is I can be quite honest about the scale of the problem. So I'm going to say three quite provocative things. At least you will judge whether they're provocative. About, firstly, the nature of the crisis of political economy that is destroying successive governments' ability to run this country. It's knocked over 5 Conservative prime ministers in, 7 years, 8 years. And I think the public service contract goes to the heart of that. Secondly, I'm going to go for the hard one, which is the one I know the most about, which is health and care. No public service could more save us, could more make us as an economy and a society, or is more breaking us at the moment. And if we can't solve health, we're in real trouble. And thirdly, my prescription, which is bold devolution. And hands up all of you who can remember CCT, compulsory competitive tendering. That really ages me. Go on, higher hands. Yeah, it was a great Conservative reform back in the late 80s that said basically councils, if they're doing something, have got to compulsorily tender it out. They can't just sit on it and hire lots of people in unionised duffel coats to do it badly. They've got to give the private sector a chance, which is why Serco and all those companies run services generally so much better. And I want to make a call for compulsory mutualisation tendering, and I'll come to why. So, broken model of political economy, I think in quite a lot of areas, across political economy, work, I've never known more people working harder for less. In democracy, more people voting and shouting and getting less what they thought they were voting for. We have a really deep problem, and it goes right to the heart of public services as well. And I want to suggest that there is a contract, basically, at the heart of citizenship and of government and of public services, which is basically you work, you pay your taxes, we collect them, they go into, if you pay your national insurance, a lovely idea, the National Insurance Fund, which will look after you through your life. Hasn't been a national insurance fund. It was spent by feckless politicians about 25 years ago. So we're running a sort of, I don't want to call it a Ponzi scheme, but we're promising people that if they work hard and pay their taxes, we, the government, the machine, will look after you, provide public services, provide all the infrastructure, and that's the deal. Keep working, keep paying, and we'll keep providing. And I think at a very basic level, that has broken down. People are working and they are paying, and they're not seeing the benefits of that. And I think that's at a very deep level, it's driving a whole bunch of things. Yes, a sort of revolutionary politics on the left and right, but also I think a lot of people beginning to think, why bother working harder than I have to? It's contributing to some of the worklessness. At the other end, it's contributing to the anxiety. People are working more and more to try and get what they thought the contract offers, and it isn't working. So I think we have, different public services are working in different levels. I come to my constituency. Big shout out for DWP. The universal credit reform has been a huge success. When I started, the job centre was a battle zone. People spitting, trying to punch. Don't punch our staff. It was you wouldn't want to take your hand. You took your life in your hands if you went in there. The job centre now looks like the first class departure lounge at Stansted, and job seekers are treated with real respect. So some public services I think have really performed, but in the two big ones, in education and health, I observe really dedicated public servants working really hard, beginning to lose their morale, beginning to feel that the government, it's not a party point I'm making, that governments, the machine in London doesn't reward them properly, doesn't respect them. And the best people I observe are starting to think, I can't do this. I just can't work for a broken machine anymore. And when our great teachers and our great health public servants start to think that, we are in real trouble. And I think we're quite close to it. So my first point really is that we are living through and on the cusp of, I don't think it's finished yet, a really serious crisis. And if this government doesn't succeed, and I think all of us, I certainly want them to succeed. I think they set out a very bold and ambitious package. I worry that they've overpromised, and in many areas they're going to find they're running straight back into the same structural problems of deficits that we had. But it is really, really serious. And I think we, if this isn't tackled, you'll see tax strikes. I think you'll see people leaving the country. I think you'll see some civil unrest. I think it's getting very bad. Let me take secondly health and care, which is the big one. So when Simone and I started government back in the coalition in 2010, the structural deficit, I know it's boring, it's quite important. Deficits normally governments, some years they spend more than they earn. In the years when tax receipts are sort of low, you borrow a bit of money to pay the bills. Structural deficit means that even when the economy is growing, you're burning more money than you're earning. So I call it the bonfire in the basement. And four things were driving the structural deficit in 2010. Debt interest, remember, it was bigger than all departments bar three. We capped that off through some pretty tough fiscal measures. Public sector pensions, we capped off the rise with some very painful reforms. Welfare, we capped off the rise with some very painful reforms. Health is the one that's just ballooning as we get older, as we get sicker, and as health demand goes up. So healthcare is really key. And come with me on a journey to Norfolk, 1 million people, and you will find 3 hospitals, one over in the west, sort of Kings Lynn, one in the middle, Norwich, one over at Great Yarmouth. And we structure our health system in a way that no other country would dream of. We have 5 clinical commissioning groups. They were the Landsley bodies to buy healthcare for you. 3 hospital trusts, it's 8, an ambulance trust, 9, a mental health trust, 10, a community health trust, 11. and then an integration board, 12. And 4 of them are in special measures, because there aren't 12 really world-class leaders of complex bureaucratic systems in one place. And the truth is, and I've been a health minister and been through into the machine, that it's no wonder we're in such trouble, because in health, if you deliver more for less, we say, right, you obviously don't need the money, we'll give it to this hospital who have delivered less for more. We literally punish success. And if you're a great hospital CEO and you're in the NHS, you're probably not doing it for money. What you would say is, George, could you not just let me run the bad hospital, because I can turn that round? We don't do that either. So the way we structurally allocate money in health care from the top, that is incredibly slow, expensive and bureaucratic. It's demoralizing to the people on the front line, and it's not providing joined up care. And I welcome the fact that Wes Streeting has been quite honest, about how broken this model is. It's not broken through Tory cuts. We've been pouring money in. It's broken because it's not actually delivering integrated healthcare on the ground. So I close with a bold call. For me, devolution in East Anglia, I'd like a mayor for the Eastern region, Cambridge, Suffolk, Norfolk, to do the big, hairy mayoral job to raise the private funding for infrastructure. I'd even consider standing if it was a proper job. We could take the Cambridge-Norwich Railway that has had almost no investment from government for 50 years. I think I could go to the Middle East and raise $1 billion pretty fast. We'd turn the railway stations into incubators. We'd build science parks, which fund the infrastructure. We're not using the freedom of local leaders to really drive. So I'd have an Eastern region mayor. I'd have county-based healthcare system, which is accountable and democratic. And you take out swathes of the machine in London. You never have a meeting with the NHS with fewer than 30 people in there. And there is already a postcode lottery. It's incredibly expensive and it's not working. And I would mutualize, by which I mean send a message out. If you're working in the public services and you're driven by the public service ethos, and you are either in an organization that is really badly run, you're pulling your hair out with frustrating layers of bureaucracy, we're going to give you the chance to take your unit, go independent, not for profit, mutualize, and run it better. And if you're in one that's failing, you can do it better than the machine is currently doing it. If you're doing one that's doing really well, you can then use that to help your neighbours. I think we'd unlock a renaissance of mutuality, civic, public service, local giving, and local society, which you might even call the big society. But it would be a very powerful idea. And the response from the machine is, well, the thing isn't that broken. I think it is. The crisis of morale isn't that broken. I think it is. And postcode lottery, we're already running one. The difference between cancer outcomes in North London is already 6x. So I want to suggest this is quite a deep crisis. And if this party isn't bold and honest and bold about creating the permission to reform it, not privatizing it, in case there are any journalists here, I'm not calling for the privatization of health and care. I'm talking about the localization, the mutualization, the decentralization and the integration.
Fantastic. I mean, there's so much I want to pick up there in terms of both the politics, but that practical suggestion on mutualisation, which I know Baroness Finn did a lot of work on it in government. But first, I'm just going to come to Ian for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Polly. So I'm going to beg an indulgence, and then I will make some points. And I'm going to apologise to colleagues from Demos, who might be the third or fourth time they've heard me do this. So I'd like to take you back to the 12th of September, 1912. Winston Churchill is giving a speech at a meeting which was organised by the Dundee Women's Liberal Foundation. So the contentious topic of the day is Home Rule for Ireland, and that's the crux of what Churchill is addressing in his speech. He's frequently interrupted by groups of suffragettes, something he probably might get some sympathy from Rachel Reeves from, one would imagine, but has had to pause at least once whilst the members of the group are ejected. And in between these interruptions, what he sets out is a vision for a federalised United Kingdom. And he talks about establishing 10 or 12 separate legislative bodies across the United Kingdom, which would discharge the functions entrusted to them by Parliament. They include bodies in Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands and the London, so topical based on what's been happening here recently. But in concluding, and I really don't have a passable Churchill impression, so forgive me. He said, no, absolutely not, Polly. The prospect, I am bound to say, does not seem extravagant to me. The vision does not seem to me at all disquieting. After all, we may be very little islands, but we have a very large population, and the affairs of 45 millions of persons demand far closer attention and far more intimate knowledge than they can possibly achieve from one imperial parliament. So the history of devolution in these little islands, it goes back a very long way, and Churchill's perspective is by no means the earliest on the sort of centralisation, decentralisation argument. But generally, we've defaulted to centralisation in this country. And that does seem odd, actually, because fundamentally, this vision is acknowledged as having merit. And the passage of time means that 45 million is now edging closer to 70 million. But I think when we talk about the needs of specific people and places, they are better understood at a policy level if you can get closer to those people and to those places. So the answer is obvious, and we should bold devolution, as George suggested. Well, I think maybe. So at SIPFA, we're really supportive of a rational and a principled approach to devolution. And we think it's really important and really encouraging, actually, to hear some of what's been said by fellow panelists. But we do think that needs to be about public service provision in the round and not just a conversation about local government. And I think there is a risk that it becomes a local government conversation and we miss some of those opportunities. We really are an international outlier. If you look globally, we have a highly centralised model and quite siloed approaches to delivering public services. And I think if we're looking for an evidence base, actually, a lot of the evidence base may not be in the UK. It might actually be that we need to look globally to support that case for change. So what do we think, if we're going to devolve more, what do we think needs to be different? So it requires a real mindset shift. So it requires a shift in culture. Central government will need to approach this in a way that public service providers are seen as equal partners and actually engage them in the outset with that spirit. So rather than local public service providers being delivery vehicles for central government policy, you actually need to engage local public service providers at the point at which you're developing policy in the first place. And local government and local public service providers are also going to have to acknowledge that if they are to see different powers, different funding arrangements, then they have to go hand in glove with expectations about accountability and delivery of outcomes. And those outcomes need to be local, obviously, but they also need to feed in to the overarching vision for the country. So it's about how are you contributing both locally and nationally through those deals. So maybe there needs to be a bit of a conversation of adults an adult conversation between both parts of government. And I think going into those conversations, people need to think about the ground they would be willing to cede, not just the ground they want to take, because too often it is about asking for more, when actually, in lots of cases, public service providers have enough and are struggling to deliver what they have already. But a mindset shift won't be enough, and we do need to look at some of the, there are a host of legislative and misaligned incentives within the systems that we currently operate, and we also are going to need to look at effectively how do we make sure that people are, wherever possible, playing the same game by the same rules, and there's a huge agenda to address there. What we're hoping, though, is that we can start to shift the conversation away from one which is largely focused on inputs and outputs to one which is maybe a bit more focused on outcomes. And rather than just focusing on the question of, I suppose, who is doing what, which is largely where we sit today, we can maybe bring in the questions of how and perhaps even why. And I think if we can start, use the opportunities to those conversations, we might actually get somewhere. And at the key of that, the core of that, we need to be thinking about those missions. So we need to be thinking about growth. We need to be thinking about prevention. But we need to think about how we support the delivery of those missions as equals across all tiers of government.
Fantastic. I mean, what three incredibly different and each incredibly interesting kind of provocations for us to open with. And I'm just thinking about where to take the conversation. I thought for the first part, let's talk a bit about the kind of nature of the crisis, okay, so that we can think a bit about why we need to pursue this agenda, and then get into some of those kind of solutions we started talking about around mutualisation in particular. So George, we were talking just before about this conference and the moment the party's in, and you said some public comments about kind of, is it the right time for hustings? Shouldn't we be doing the soul searching of what's gone wrong for this party in the last few years. What is the part of what's happened in public services in I guess the current misfortunes of the party?
Well, let's be honest, more than current misfortunes, the historic ejection of the Conservative Party from office is what's happened this year. And the reason I think and made the case that we didn't need a quick leadership election, we needed a few months of really deep reflection, rehabilitation, to inform some reform, is that I think if we don't do that, the daily news cycle just rushes you back into Yahoo at the dispatch box. And this is quite an important and precious moment. But to answer your question, I think certainly in my constituency, let me just start local, because that's I'm on very solid ground there. The things I heard on the doorsteps, there were 3 basically big messages about, George, I think you're a really good MP, you've worked really hard, huge supporter, voted for you nearly every time. I can't this time because, and it was generally either or all of, one, their local healthcare system. My local surgery is just in bits, people are queuing, I can't find a dentist for love nor money. The hospital A&E has got queues out under healthcare on the ground. And interestingly, when I said, the truth is we've been pouring money in and it's not coming out on the ground, I thought people would say, no, it's not, it's Tory cuts. It's not at all. There was a lot of people, in fact, the vast majority said, yes, it's not working. We know our money's being poured in and it's not coming out on the ground. So that was one. The second was conduct in office. You don't need me to go through why people might be talking about conduct in office. And the third was, I'm poorer. And I don't seem to see any prospect. I'm working harder and I'm getting poorer. Now, you could argue, that's cost of living crisis in a place like Norfolk. If cost of energy goes up 30-40%, everything's a lot more expensive. And it's a cut. It's not a Tory cut. It's 30-40% on everything. But health was the big one. So for all those years of safe in our hands, we'll put more money in, trying to defy the Labour accusation that we don't love the NHS. And I've absolutely been part of that. I was in Department of Health with Jeremy Hunt. And I deeply do think the NHS, properly run, is a massive national asset. In 2 areas, particularly if you work as I have in the small business innovation sector, we don't talk about that enough. If you're going to start a company in this country, it's much easier than in America. You don't have to pick up somebody's healthcare costs. The NHS is the most extraordinary underpinning supporter of an innovation economy. And at the other end, the life sciences is one of our biggest sectors. It's pulling in billions. And if the NHS properly integrated with it, we could help the NHS tackle disease better. So I think it's, we as a party, we've got to make a much stronger case about why public services are so important. I've given you a couple. There's lots of other reasons. For many people, it's the opportunity ladder. It's what takes you out from where you grew up, gives you a chance in life. And we don't talk about the ethos of public services. We don't talk about the role they play in our society properly. And we reduce the whole thing to a very utilitarian in-out. We put more money in than them, Yahoo conversation. It's no wonder people working in public services are so depressed. And you could only really reform it if there was a crisis. Well, I suggest we have a crisis right now. And I think actually in health, Wes Streeting, if I read him right, I think he is brave and he's prepared to speak the truth and not say, we're going to repair the NHS after 14 years of Tory cuts, because he knows that's not the problem. We're going to reform it because it's not working. And I, for one, wish him well in having that honest conversation. And I just close with this. The historians in you will know probably that when the Labour Party created the NHS, there was a big debate, unfortunately, in the Labour Party about it. And one group said it should be local, civic, community-based, patient pathway centred. Basically, here in the South Wales valleys, we look after each other through a mutual, connected society of mining communities. And the other half said, no, we should have the National Health Service. It'll become, we'll stuff their mouths with gold and we'll create this huge bureaucratic machine. Now, I understand why, because they were terrified that the GPs, the doctors, the BMA and the Tories would kill it. But my argument is it's now become a monster in itself. It's eating its own people. It's depressing its own people who joined it to work in it. and it's not effective. So I think we've got to make a much richer, deeper case as Conservatives about the role of public services in our society in order to win permission to even have this conversation. Because if it's just about money, I don't think we even get a hearing.
Does that answer your why question?
So I think so. I mean, I think so. We talk about public spending an awful lot. So when it comes to public service provision, we talk about what are we going to spend on services, and that there's a bit of, it's a phrase my colleagues use, but there's a bit of single-use plastics about that sometimes. We never talk about how we invest in our public services. We never say, actually, if you were to invest in the well-being of your population, you have happier, healthier people who are able to, be productive in the workplace and those. So I think it may be semantics, but I do think there's an opportunity for us to think about investment. So actually, and it's difficult to do at the moment because you have to kind of, you can't turn the taps off with the demands that we have. But if we can't start painting some picture about, actually, if we were to make this investment in this group of people, or we were trying to achieve these outcomes, these are the benefits to society. And one of the challenges there is the silos. So if you look at local service provision, actually, if you then track that money back through the hosting departments and back into Treasury, well, if you spent money as a local authority, you're accountable, to CLG, communities and local government. But if some of that money was to result in a benefit in DHCS, then actually, surprisingly, you're not quite so interested. So we need to work out how we can how we can build that case for change and not worry and make sure that we're concerned about how the benefit accrues to the citizen or to the individual or to the communities rather than which bit of government it goes back into in terms of how things were divvied up in the first place.
There was just, before we move on to the mutualisation question, there was something that stuck in my mind that you said about the relationship between different layers of government. You said we need a more adult conversation. What were you getting at there? What's the problem?
So I think if you look at a lot of, I think the NHS, this is true in the NHS, but I think it's definitely true in local government. Actually, what local government is a fantastic delivery vehicle, or has been a fantastic delivery vehicle for central government policy. So a lot of those demand-led pressures, they're kind of defined. Some of those are defined in statute in terms of, thou shalt deliver this service this way, based on whatever criteria. What we aren't as good, what we haven't been as successful as doing as a country is saying, actually, what we want you to do, local service provider, is deliver these outcomes. Mm-hmm. So could you make sure that, that people in your area are able to stay at home independently for as long as possible, and how you do that, actually, you've got some flexibility and some freedoms around the how you do that. It's very much, well, at this point, this criteria is met, this is the service that you have to deliver. And I think that's just a real disservice. You don't get innovation. You don't get people who are, I think it's George saying, who are close to it on the ground, feeling that they can be part of the solution because they're just having to follow a process kind of quite blindly.
Thank you. Finn, did you want to pick up on either of those points, or can I move on to? No, okay. So I wanted to ask you about that area you spent in the Cabinet Office and some of the innovations, because that really was, I suppose, the last big era of public sector reform, thinking about all these things in the round. What can we learn from that period?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you threw the question at me when I came in. Of course, your mind starts racing back. But it is true that sadly there has been very little reform of public services since 2016. And there have been, there was COVID, there's been Brexit, there have been a number of possible reasons. But that was, looking back on the coalition government, it was a very reforming time where we did do some things worked, some things didn't. And there are just a couple of observations I'd make before going on to the mutuals programme, which I loved and has stalled, and that drives me mad. But it was, first of all, just, how difficult it can be. There will be to make omelets, you crack, you have to break eggs, and so for the example, I mean, George referred to the UC program, the Universal Credit Program. I mean, my goodness, I can't tell you how difficult that was, and the criticisms that were made during the coalition and how awful it was, and we got a lot of things wrong because they started off with a very old-fashioned technological solution which wasn't going to work. I think it was called Pathfinder or something, and as a result, Mike Bracken, who was the rather revolutionary genius who came in, having set up Guardian Online, which was totally revolutionary then, to run the gov.uk and the digital program, and the Universal Credit Triumph was actually a total success for the digital agenda, because the fact that it worked silently and well during COVID was actually because it was handed over to the digital team, who knew what they were doing, created a spine, but it wasn't easy to persuade the powers that be to allow the digital team to take it on rather than the old-fashioned technology. And the second thing is that it's the permission to criticize. You're not going to actually get any reforms through unless you say things aren't working. And when I started, you weren't allowed to breathe a word of criticism about the civil service. Jewel in the crown, Rolls Royce, this thing, and you sort of think, really, is it? And I think that did become a permission to criticize that, actually it's not working properly, but we don't have to do it so that everyone feels terrible about it. Let's make it better. And I think we're getting there with the health service now. I think the infected blood inquiry was quite an eye-opener for many people. And I think now people are beginning to say the NHS is not this sacred cow. We do actually need to say it's a great it's a great institution, but it's not working properly and it needs to reform. So that's why I would love to come on to the part of the program that with Francis that he adored and was absolutely, I think, the way forward, which is, as George referred to, the mutualisation program. And what people don't really, when we talk about mutuals, it was described as you would spin out from the public sector. So you would spin out from the health service. But those who were working in these mutuals still thought that they were part of the health service. They were simply responsible for being able to spend their money on the front line of where they thought it was necessary to be able to spend it. So those who could identify the problems didn't have to go through the usual NHS bureaucracy. And I'll give you, there was a fabulous woman who addressed the Conservative conference, I think in 2014, who told, these wonderful stories about the mutual she was in. One of them was about a man who needed to have his leg amputated. No, not his leg, he had an ulcerated leg. He lived on the street. He was terrified about going into hospital, and had it not been treated, it would have led to the leg being amputated. They talked to him in this mutual and discovered that what he was terrified about was the fact he had a dog, and his dog wouldn't be able to survive without him. So they decided that they would pay for the dog with their money to go into kennels. He went in safely, he had his operations, he was safely treated. He therefore saved the NHS a fortune in not having to have his leg amputated. His quality of life was improved, talking about outcomes. But it was just a lovely story about actually that was the loosening of the funds. And the pride that, I used to visit hospices where you would go into the store cupboard, and because everyone was looking after their own money and feeling a personal responsibility for it, you'd go into these immaculate sort of store cupboards where every single, when you took out a needle, that will cost you this amount of money, or that's going to cost 5p for this. But it was people really wanting to make everything work in a maximum benefit way. So it was a program, and it's been killed off pretty much, and it's a real shame that it's been killed off, because it's actually the way forward. And what devolution could properly lead to, which is keeping a sort of totally tight control of the central funds, possibly, but allowing those on the front line to have a looser area of being able to spend the money where it's needed.
And that's a really powerful policy intervention that speaks to some of the work we're doing at Demos around a more liberated public service that really liberates that decision to the front line. And Ian, it might even answer some of your how question as well. I'm very keen to open up to the audience for questions. So if anyone's got any questions. So.
Hi, my name's Anthony Breach. I'm a Associate Director at Centre Cities, where I lead on devolution and local finance. So obviously we've had a devolution agenda in England, as you say, for the past 10 years or so. I think it's broadly considered a political success. But the one thing we haven't had is fiscal devolution, as Ian has alluded to. It's still very centralised by international standards. We do also have a massive funding crisis in local government. We have these huge statutory needs that aren't being filled, and places aren't able to grow their own tax base to fund those services. Is part of the way forward in devolution, and especially fiscal devolution, using it to fix that local funding crisis?
Fantastic. I'd love to get a response from each of you on that. It might just be yes, 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 but George.
Yes. I mean,
what should it look like?
So George Osborne's going to come up twice in this, which is the first fringe event I've heard his name twice. He used to refer to the twin instincts of conservatism, a Heseltinian and a Lawsonian. I mean, there are other instincts, but in the context of economics. And I'm a self-styled Heseltinian. I mean, not on Europe really, but on interventionism and place. And I just think if we take my beloved county of Norfolk, if we not Suffolk, but other counties can apply. Imagine this. Imagine if we said, okay, we've broken down the Treasury numbers for your geography. It could be a city, it could be a district. And this, over the next 10 years, is what's going to happen to your health costs, your obesity-related costs, doesn't matter, right? Take a unit of public service. That's what we in the Treasury are going to have to pay for, which is why we're cutting everything. If you could reduce the rate of growth of that increase, I don't mean spend less, I mean just reduce the rate of growth of that, we'll let you keep half. It turns out there's some very good academic studies on this in healthcare, that 10% is plenty. If you put that 10% back into not Porsches, not privatising it, put it back into training and into good coffee and into nurturing and careers, and that is a revolutionary effect. Imagine on the other side, if you said, by the way, this in Norfolk is your this is your GDP, and if you can grow your economy and generate more revenues to the Treasury, we'll let you keep half. It's called tax increment financing. It's how Washington paid for all that infrastructure after the war. And the Treasury hate it, of course, absolutely hate it. I've had so many conversations with successive chancellors, and they basically say, well, I think it's, George, if you borrow money against your place, that's public sector debt. Is it? If it's borrowed against an asset, against a place, basically they hate to lose control. And they've got long memories from the 70s and 80s and Red Robbo and Red Kent. Most local governments, local councils these days are far better run than most Whitehall departments. So I'm a big fiscal devolutionist, and I think it would unlock a huge amount of sort of 80-20, 80% would flourish, and then government could think about the 20% that's really got stubborn problems. Long yes.
Yes, I mean, mine's a similar yes. Just as an example of what used to drive me mad in government is this whole talking about the HMT hating things. They absolutely, the Treasury thinks that they control the finances by handing out sums of money to the departments during the spending review. Not once do they ever ask how that money has been spent back. I mean, we've tried, and we tried to put, you put out your capital, and then you have the accountability lines back into like a sort of finance centre in government, if you like. And this whole concept was regarded with horror by the Treasury. I mean, they did a reluctant study and they sort of defaulted to another department, and they just didn't take it very seriously. But absolutely, if you can work out how the money is being spent, you trust the people to spend the money, but there is accountability back, then it's what's not to like about the model. And I never understood why the Treasury was so hostile.
Did you ever ask why the Treasury was so hostile? Didn't like it?
Well, so Francis Maud put in place this the thing that the Treasury didn't like. We saved a lot of money. We saved cumulatively something like £50 billion over the 5 years of the coalition government, and that was not by taking money from frontline public services. That was from the running costs of government. So it was part of the public sector reforms. the civil service, the numbers were reduced like for like by 20%, without losing productivity, in fact, possibly increasing it. And putting in place spending controls so that, when departments wanted to spend large sums of money, it was synthesized. So you actually had the great campaign for various parts of government rather than all these odd little campaigns in different government departments. Now, the permanent secretaries therefore didn't like it very much because it was their fiefdom taken away. And the Treasury didn't like these savings because they weren't folding money. They couldn't, they were not, they weren't part of how they could balance their rigid books. And that was the frustrating part, because they never saw these savings as proper savings in government, because they didn't have a system whereby that could have been plowed back in.
It kind of it links a bit to what Ian was saying about that kind of adult to adult relationship as well.
It's
and building
infantilising.
trust.
It's an infantilising game. Treasury gives a department money and says, no, you've got to spend it properly, or else money will take it back from you. And then they never actually take it back for the right reason.
No.
They take it back if you haven't spent it.
So departments squirrel it away. And then all finance directors in departments have, slush funds somewhere.
Yeah. Ian, do you have a little slush fund?
Unfortunately not, no. But talking of which, so yes is the short answer. I'm going to caveat it slightly. So tourist tax, we should just do it. I just don't understand why we wouldn't. It's a pretty common thing internationally, and I think it will raise money that could be used by areas to hopefully not poured straight into just meeting the demand that we're facing. So I think that would be a good test case. I think we do have to be aware. So it depends how much of a virtue you want to make of differences within a place. So all places start from a different place. Each place has different strengths, different weaknesses. So I think you have to be aware of that, because otherwise you do create a haves and haves. There's a real risk you create a haves and have-nots situation. And I don't know the number of times poor Surrey seem to be the authority that get it in the neck the most, but everyone compares what their council tax increase would be versus Surrey's council tax increase, and obviously it's starkly different. And I think that's probably the crux of the issue for me, which is yes, but please not using the existing mechanisms that we have. So business rates. And council tax, they're not very good taxes, and they're definitely not very good taxes in a changing world where the value of a property is probably not a very good starting point, especially not the value of a property or what a property would have been had it been built in 1991. So I think there's I think yes, but I like what George has just said, which is if you can have a sensible conversation with an area about what are you contributing, how do you take your share of that and how do you put that back in, that's a great conversation to have. If we come back to how much of my business rates can I retain, maybe that's the short-term conversation, but we need to move on from that at some point fairly quickly afterwards, I think.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Any more questions in the middle?
Yeah, hi, Ben from the National Children's Bureau. I just wondered.
National
Children's Bureau. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit maybe to, I guess, some of the black hole when it comes to local finances in terms of education healthcare plans, but also, I guess, the care sector. And in particular, just we were talking about mutualisation, I guess what's gone wrong there in terms of private companies coming in to provide care for children who have been taken into care, and kind of what's gone wrong there and how that would be different. And then maybe also just on the morale of some of the frontline workers, I guess, how do you marry that with a criticism culture as well? And how do you, kind of support frontline workers whilst at the same time?
That was expertly 3 questions. That was brilliant. Thank you, Ben.
No, I mean they are fair criticisms and totally pertinent observations, because mutuals have failed, and I think there is a hostility to them in the public sector. The NHS never liked the NHS spin-offs, and for reasons I can never quite understand. I suppose it was because the staff owned them, but also there was an element of private funding, and obviously there's more of an element of risk then. So we need to work out how we can balance up that that risk area, you know, for places that failed. But I mean, I think it was Hinchinbrook Hospital, you know, that this was actually a very successful hospital, and they just handed it. I mean, it was heavily criticised, and it was, you know, I visited that hospital, and they'd painted the walls white as opposed to the purple and yellow that they had been before, and it had enthusiastic staff. And you went to these mutuals, hospices, or whatever, and you would ask the staff, would you go back to how it was before? And not one of them wanted to go back, but every single member of staff felt that they were part of the NHS or the public services. They didn't see themselves as part of a private enterprise. So the problem is nothing's been done at scale. It's not necessarily the perfect model, but it is the model to allow people to actually run what they see they need.
I wonder whether the
pace.
burning platform moment that we're in, that George was talking about, creates a different climate for that kind of reform. Is it easier to reform when it doesn't feel like there's much choice?
Well, the necessity always sort of forces quite a lot of reform agenda, yes.
George, did you want to come in on it?
Yeah, I think Ben's question is brilliant. It's complex, and I was not going to do it justice here. But in Norfolk, on care, I think children's care and elderly care. Elderly care in Norfolk is one of our biggest economic sectors. It's huge. Norfolk will be the first district to have more pensioners than non-pensioners. I have 46 care homes in my patch, which is one more than my primary schools. And in elderly care, there are an awful lot of care homes doing a reasonable job on a pittance. There are some private equity houses that have gone into care that have just been appalling. And my party hasn't been calling that out. And I was talking this morning about markets. We've given the impression at times that we think all markets are good. No. Markets need constructs, they need values, they need regulating. So I think there's a mixed package on private provision in some of the care sectors. The single biggest problem in Norfolk's elderly care and education, EHC and SEND, is the failure of the public sector. So Norfolk's Mental Health Foundation, the NSFT, has been through an appalling series of, this is all in the public domain, an appalling series of defensive, bureaucratic, classic sort of cover-ups, nothing to see here. It's a terrible culture very often in the NHS and healthcare. The professionals ring round and said there's really no problem. Well, there clearly was a problem. There were some overdone cuts in austerity and then a very defensive culture. And finally, we're gripping it. And what are we doing? We're localising it. So instead of there being Norfolk and Suffolk, one mental health trust with lots of people saying nothing to see here, we're creating 6 hubs on the ground, which are properly integrated as part of community care. So even at a relatively local level, I think the answer is, and I'd love to mutualise it, but at least we're localising it and we're personalising it instead of what happens at regional, let alone national bureaucracies, whereas it becomes just a problem to be hidden for as long as you can. When it's your patch and it's your area, then it's very obvious. The big problem I think we've got is that so many people in my part of the world don't think this is their business anymore. Unless it's their mum or dad or their child, then it's their business. But generally, we've created a culture where people think that looking after people is well, the state does that, doesn't it? Or charities. And one of the things I love about mutualisation and localisation is that it also personalises it. And I think this is linked to care tax and all the rest of it. I'm sure I'm not the only person. I have an ageing mother in North Norfolk who's 88 in a house that's worth, I don't know, 30 times more than she paid for it before Norfolk cottages became sort of collectible items for millionaires. I wouldn't mind if some of the value of that house goes into providing her care. But what I would mind is if it all goes to London to be frittered away on whatever happens to be the political moment, the cause of the moment. And I don't think we're thinking enough about care in the community in the sense of how we fund it and whose responsibility it is. And I think if we devolve it, we'd get a much richer conversation.
There's one more hand. Now I'm dilemmaed. I like to do a gender split. So sorry, sir. I'm going to go to the lady at the front. I like to.
Sorry, I feel really
that's
bad
okay.
now.
Now I feel really guilty about everyone.
But you can't see the other one. So.
So whoever it is. So I'm a police and crime commissioner, and you mentioned police and crime commissioners I represent Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, so we're one of the bigger areas. And in terms of devolution, I met with Jim McMahon, the new devolution minister, 3 weeks ago, and he talked about the white paper that's coming out in November, which will set up a Council of Nations, which will have the leaders of the devolved administrations of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales sitting on it, but also all of the elected mayors. He talked about obviously English devolution and their absolute commitment to get all of the north of England into devolved, basically MCAs, mayoral combined authorities, in the next 8-9 months, I think, by the elections for next year, I'm assuming. Now, he also talked about there will be a devolution framework document that will be contained within that white paper. And that very much being around the fact that they really like what the previous Conservative governments, coalition governments have done around devolution, but it's not going to be one size fits all. So that devolution deal 1 of transport and skills and the old LEP economic growth functions, that actually now, from my area, we've got a big port in Southampton, so it could be that it was something that's much more maritime, bespoke for my patch, that's what they want to do. Now, if you've all spoken about health at quite some length, we know when we knock on doors that is what people actually really care about. We know that's what is causing every government of any party pain. Therefore, if you were to take on health in your devolution deal 1, which is a big area, would you advocate local taxation then to support that? And secondly, you spoke about accountability and governance. What do you think that should look like?
Wow. All right, we've got 2 minutes left.
2
and
minutes.
That was such a good question. But does anyone want to, Ian, do you want to have a quick stab at that?
So I would have. So I think you have to see these deals as things that will iterate, and so I think like any time you try something new, you want to give yourselves the best possible chance of success. So I wouldn't include health in a first round. I think there's a much bigger and broader conversation we need to have as a country around that. I suspect any conversation at the moment about local taxation will be about business rates retention, just because, again, there's quite a lot of heavy lifting that you'll need to do to, for that not to be the case. In terms of accountability, I mean, this is where they've also been really clear about mayors, haven't they? And although they've talked about combined county council authorities, I think it's, very clearly looking at a mayoral model. And, to a degree that makes sense, because if you're going to have a council of nations, regions, and that needs to be a manageable number of people to have. Well, she needs to be having adult-to-adult conversations. You're also going to have manageable conversations, haven't you? So I suppose that's the answer in terms of the accountability. I know they're also toying with. I've heard them toying with the idea of sort of maybe regional, like some sort of select committee on a kind of a regional basis. 9 regions. So you could, and again, you could understand why you might want to do that, because you need to do it in a manageable way. So I suppose, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think be careful we don't bite off more than we can chew to start off with, because if you can make a success of the things that you do first time around, when the next time you go, you have that conversation, you've got some trust and some credibility. And I think we have to be realistic, frankly, that some of the sort of structural heavy lifting at that pace, 8 to 9 months for well, that's just not going to happen. So we're really going to have to do the best we can with some of the structures we already have.
I know that we are losing George at past on the dot, so I'm going to have to wrap up there and say that was a really, really interesting conversation. I felt like we went in lots of different directions, but covered a lot of ground, from the politics to the how we do it as well. And thank you for your brilliant questions and for spending this time with us. So thank you to our speakers, thank you to our audience. I did actually really